Hey friends, my name is Jake. Welcome to Canadian Cutting Edge, and this is a talk video. In fact, it's a bit of a rant, and I want to challenge you guys to do something. I'm speaking directly to other knife reviewers and to the rest of you guys, just regular viewers, subscribers, knife enthusiasts, people who like knives. There's a problem with knives these days. It's probably existed for a long time. I've been a knife nut for quite a long time, and I've been doing this channel for almost 5.5 years now, and I've reviewed over 1,000 knives, and I find something consistently happening with knives. Granted, I'm a budget knife reviewer, but I have reviewed other knives that cost a little bit more money, knives up to $300 American in cost. But mostly I review knives that are under $60, $50, down to $20, whatever. The odd knife that's, just a little bit under $100, but not very many over $100. But I have found those knives that I have reviewed that cost more have the same problems, just not quite as severe as the budget knives. What is Jake going on about? How well knives are sharpened at the factory. So I'm talking production knives. I'm not talking about customs or mid-techs or stuff like that. I'm talking about, production knives where the company makes a few thousand of a knife. You go and buy this in a store somewhere, either online or on a shelf somewhere, and you take it home, you open it out, and it's your knife. I want to issue a challenge that will help to fix a major problem with how companies sharpen their knives. I think they do a terrible job. For the most part, they just do a terrible job sharpening their knives. Of course, there's the odd good knife that's been sharpened really well. And I'm not just talking about, you pull the knife out and you can cut stuff or you can't cut stuff. Because you can get a sharp edge while still doing a terrible job of sharpening a knife. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Basically, what I mean is you can have really wonky grind angles, or you can have, thicknesses behind the grind issues. Those are the two main issues that you can get with sharpening a knife. Because generally, production knives are sharpened by hand. There's some, belt spinning. So the person's sitting at this machine, there's a belt coming down or a wheel, and they slide the knife across that wheel and sharpen it. You've seen videos of people doing that kind of sharpening all the time. So it's hand sharpening, and because it's hand sharpening, it's got loads of room for human error. Now, how much does the company care about the sharpening? I'm suggesting they don't care enough. And I want to do something. I want to stir up the knife community so that knife manufacturers will care more about how well their knives are sharpened at the factory. So let's get over to the tabletop and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Please watch and give your 2 cents worth down below, and I'll ask you to do even more than that. So keep watching. So here's some examples of some of the knives I've reviewed in the last while, and some of them still have the original sharpness on them. Actually, some of these I haven't reviewed quite yet, but some of these, they had pretty decent sharpness from the factory, and some of them, they just weren't done all that well. This one I've gone already and put a nice mirror edge on it. Took a fair bit of work to get there because it had been poorly sharpened. Why do we just roll over in silence instead of telling the manufacturers that we really do care about how well knives are sharpened at the factory? Why do we just roll over and take it? At least that's what it looks like people are doing. For the last long time, the last 250 odd knives that I've reviewed, I have measured the grind angles and how thick the knife is behind the grind for every single knife that I've reviewed. For the first while, I was just measuring, about 1.5 inches up from the heel of the blade, and I'd measure the grind angle there, turn it over, measure the grind angle there. If you want to know how I measure the grind angles, I've got a whole video on that, but very briefly, I mount the knife in my guided sharpening system, so it's clamped in there. I take a Sharpie, a black marker and I run the marker along the edge, the whole grind of the cutting edge. And then I take my sharpening stone and I adjust the height, the angle, until the sharpening stone wipes the marker off all the way from the heel to the cutting edge. And what I'm calling the heel, here, maybe this knife will be better for showing that since we've got the black coating. The heel is where the black coating ends and the sharpening begins. And then the cutting edge is, everybody knows the cutting edge, that's the very tip, the super sharp part. So some knives are just sharpened terribly and some knives are sharpened well. And I started figuring out that sometimes, here's a knife with a factory sharpness on it. Take a look at this edge and watch how the light changes along the edge. It should be, fairly the same color all the way along, but notice how it's darker down here? That's because that's a shadow. As I tilt the knife up, it becomes bright. So that's a different angle there than it is on the rest of it. And the problem with some knives, like this side, is just terrible. You can get, the light reflecting here, but it's dark over here and it's dark over here because the grind angle is changing all the way along the length of the knife. Sometimes going back and forth, but usually, just wonking around. Very often, the angle difference between the heel and the blade and the tip of the blade is 8, 9 degrees difference, 7, 8, 9 degrees difference a lot of the time. Probably at least half of the time, there's at least a 5-degree difference between the tip and the heel of the blade. Sometimes, some knives, where do I have the one I'm wanting to talk about? Here we go. Here's the Civivi fracture. This knife, on this side, it's all wonky. It's pretty bad. There's about 6 degrees difference along the length of the blade. But on this side, it's like 0.1, 0.2 degrees difference along the length. 21.1, 21.2 along the whole length of that edge. So clearly, it can be sharpened well. What I suspect is happening is maybe the person's right hand dominant, and so when he's sharpening this side, he does a great job, he or she. And then when they sharpen this side, they're doing a bunch of this as they're going down the blade. Of course, not this much, but they're just, wonking around. And that just seems to happen all of the time. Worse than that, one side can have an average grind angle of maybe 27 degrees, and then the other side, and that's not true of this knife, the other side could be like 14 degrees. And that happens quite a lot as well. And that's all because, they're sharpening, and when they switch hands to turn around, they switch angles as well. I've been keeping track of about 250 knives, over 250 knives. And lately, I've been starting to take the measurements in multiple places. At least 3 places, usually 4 places along the blade. And I've been keeping track of those. And when it is wonky, I tell my viewers what all those different spots are. I'm hoping this video goes and gets a lot of traction in the knife community because it's something that I really think is important. I know I might sound a bit wordy, but I'm trying to make a point and I'm trying to make it quite strongly. I want to challenge all knife reviewers to measure the grind angles of every knife they're going to review. Watch my video on how I measure grind angles if you're not sure of how I do it. Because you can do it. If you've got a guided sharpening system, you can definitely measure the grind angles of your knife. And you might be surprised, even if you normally review, higher end knives, the $200, $300, $500 knives, you're going to find that the problem exists. You've probably noticed it when you've been sharpening knives, where sometimes you got to take off a fair bit of steel the first time you sharpen it, just to get a consistent edge all the way along. And that's a sure sign that the edge, the grind, has been wonky, different angles on the length of the blade. This is a fairly new brand called War Spear. I've not reviewed any of them yet, but they seem pretty decent. I also want you to measure how thick the knife is just behind the grind. So again, going back to this knife, right at the black part on both sides, and you measure how thick it is. That is if you've got either a vernier calipers to do it with, or better yet, there's different equipment that you can use to measure how thick something is behind the grind. You just have to be careful that you're measuring just at that spot and not further up the blade or something. But you'll get better at it as time goes. There's other problems with knives that I want the community, the knife industry to change, but one step at a time. So measure it and then tell your viewers what you find. What's that going to do? That's going to do two things. That's going to educate the consumer. I mostly review knives that are of the budget category, the low-cost knives like this shoes is, because there's a lot of guys out there that have a really limited budget. And so they want to buy the best knife that they can afford, just like everybody else. If you've got $500 in your budget, you still want to buy the best knife that you can afford. So if we reviewers take these measurements down and we share them with our viewers, then they can make a more educated decision when they want to buy a knife, instead of just having the reviewer say things like, this is a great knife, feels wonderful on the hand, it cuts awesome, it looks so cool, blah, blah, blah. And, it might be a little bit facetious here on how a review sounds, but I'm one of those guys who thinks details and specs are important. And I really believe that they are. I want to pressure knife manufacturers to do a better job with how they sharpen knives. Now, am I making a mountain out of a molehill? I don't think so. Do you remember when you first started getting into knives? When you first started wanting to sharpen knives? Some of you have been in the knife hobby for a long time. Some of you might be just fairly new to it. And you got your first knife here. Let me grab a different one. And you wanted to sharpen the knife. And you heard, people on different videos and stuff say, well, you match the grind angle because, the manufacturer knows what they're doing. And so do that. But the problem is your knife didn't have a grind angle that you could match because it varied along the length of the knife. So which grind angle do I match? Which angle's the best angle? All kinds of questions. And that's my dog Bandit in the background scratching on a pillow. It's his pillow, so it's okay if he does that. So what do you do? So there's purists who say you have to sharpen on a whetstone. That's even harder to learn how to match a grind angle on a whetstone because you can't see if you're getting the exact angle that it was. And again, if the angle varied, even if it only varies a degree along the length, or 2 degrees along the length of the knife, it's just such a tricky thing. How do you match a grind angle, basically, is what I'm saying, when the grind angle can't be matched. And it just can't be. There's not one angle along the length of a knife. Now, I'm not expecting knife manufacturers to be perfect, especially, on budget knives like this little Sanren Mew. This is a very low-cost knife, so I don't expect the grind angle to be perfect. But I want the grind angle to be good. So that's what this is about. For those of us with guided sharpening systems where the blade is held in place either by a clamp or with magnets or somehow held in place, it's a little bit easier, but it's still tricky because we've got our knife held in place and we've got the stone held in place on a rod, and we slide it back and forth. But on one part of the blade, here we go, on one part of the blade, we're sharpening, what I'm calling the hip, where the black ends and the silver from the sharpening begins. Here we're sharpening on the hip, and here we're sharpening on the edge, and back here again we're sharpening on the hip again. And what is going on? And it can get so frustrating. Regardless of what sharpening method we use, we find that by the time we have a consistent edge along the length of the blade, we've wasted a lot of steel. Because, over here where we were just sharpening on the hip, and here just on the edge, by the time we've got everything all matched up, we've removed a fair bit of steel. There's two issues I have with that. One is we've removed a lot of steel from a finite knife that we want to keep, because the more steel we take away, the thicker it gets behind the grind, so we don't like that idea. And the second issue is it's taken a lot of time and effort. It's a lot of work to make a wonky edge into a consistently even edge. So my point is, I think our job, at least as far as this video is concerned, is to encourage manufacturers to be better, do better. You're making knives that sometimes cost, this one's a little bit more money, this one's close to $100 US, or, something like this thing with S35VN, it costs a little bit more money than a lot of other knives. But even for those guys that are buying, the low budget knives, like this rake knife, which I quite like, no matter how much money we're spending on a knife, it sucks when we get a knife that, even though our first cuts with it are really good because it's actually sharp on the edge, when it comes to do our main maintenance, sharpening, the knife is just all over the place. Those of us who are used to it, yeah, we're used to it. And I know I'm repeating myself a little bit. It's just the way my brain functions. So sorry if I'm taking too long to get to the point. We want our knives to be easier to maintain, less wasted steel, less time wasted. So in the nutshell, the nutshell of my point that I want to make here is, if you're a reviewer, please start taking measurements and, give those measurements to the public. I'm not trying to embarrass knife companies. What I'm trying to do is encourage knife companies to do a better job. So I also don't want to shame the reviewers who, maybe you're just starting out or something and you don't have enough money to buy all this other stuff. If you do have a guided sharpening system, you can do the main thing, and that is measuring the grind angle along the length of a knife in a few places. It takes a little bit of time, not an awful lot. And I've got a worksheet that I use. I can even share my worksheet with you that I use for every review. And I just fill in all the information there, and then I start making my video. The question, basically, at the end of all of this is, would you rather buy a knife, regardless of the price, that is well sharpened, not only sharp on the edge, but well sharpened along the full length of it, good grind angles, or would you rather buy the kind of knives that are available right now? I want the world of knives to change. This is production knife manufacturing that I'm talking about. Can you help me change it? Thanks everyone for liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing. And remember, friends, cut towards your chum, not your thumb. Bye for now.